Is Politics Unscripted. It is that time for the Editor's Choice segment where we discuss the stories making headlines in front of your favorite newspapers. And to help me do this, we are joined by Eyewitness News Editor-in-Chief, and you will know him as the former political editor in this station, Sbu Ngalwa. He sits with me in the studio, and we're hoping to be joined by legal journalist Karyn Maughan in a bit. Sbu, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Mgambi.
This is home for you.
Left. I'm just missing my earpiece.
Good to have you back, man.
Sure.
Good to have you back. Listen, let's talk about the process of interviewing the candidates vying for the position of Chief Justice of the country. In front of me is the Sunday Times, Madam Chief Justice, in inverted commas there. That's to Justice Mandisa Maya, and she's now officially recommended by the JSC to basically become the next Chief Justice. But there's been a complaint, in fact a flurry of that, to say this was a shambolic process. Your thoughts and how you saw these interviews unfold, because they were there for all to see.
Sure. I think if she gets appointed, in fact, the very recommendation is a momentous occasion in South African history, in that we will, for the first time, if the president accepts that you will have a first female Chief Justice. I think perhaps most people are struggling with the interview process in terms of how some of the commissioners carried themselves during this process, including the fact that you now hear some people saying that the process must be reviewed and that it should be changed. I've heard others even saying that a group, eminent people or experts, must be the one that appoint judges. I think that's problematic because if you go back, there was a reason why the JSC was constituted as is. In that under apartheid, you had a president who could just appoint judges in consultation with the Minister of Justice,
sure,
or behind closed doors. But during the negotiations, it was found that the powers of the president, in terms of understanding the separation of powers and to give effect to that, should be tempered down. Hence, you have this process as is. What most people seem to have is how, obviously, some commissioners may have carried themselves. You saw that ugly exchange between the Minister of Justice and Julius Malema, the leader of the EFF. The reality is that nothing is wrong with the system. What is wrong is probably the people and how they are conducting themselves. Yeah. And perhaps what ought to be done is to be looked at how you can in a way, regulate that conduct rather than changing it. Yeah. Because going back would not be going back to what was before the JSC was constituted would actually not be ideal, especially for transparency and for a democracy like ours.
Karyn Maughan, you were part of that, you were inside that room. Let me not say you were part of the interviewing process. You were in that room. You saw everything unfold. For Sbu, in a way, this is democracy at play. This is what was meant to be, bar the conduct of some of the commissioners. How do you see it?
I think, the process ultimately is about finding a person to lead a judiciary that, in the word of one of the other, judges who was interviewed last year, is bleeding and rudderless, was the words that were used. We know the judiciary is under incredible attack, and under attack from some of the people that were in the room when they had to choose the person who would lead the judiciary. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past and what emerged most horrifically first in April last year during the appointment of the Constitutional Court judges was an overt political agenda by certain of the commissioners to sideline judges who were eminently qualified and to put people in place who were not necessarily as qualified or on apparently problematic grounds, including that of religion. And we saw what happened with Justice Daya Pillay, who was at the stage an acting justice of the Constitutional Court. Her interview, in which Chief Justice Mogoeng raised certain questions about a relationship with Pravin Gordhan without giving her any warning, as is appropriate with the JSC process, was so severe that she actually chose not to participate or put her name forward again. And when CASAC took that entire process on review, including the deliberations, in which it emerged that a list had been put forward by Mogoeng, which the JSE then endorsed without proper deliberations. The JSE chose not to defend itself. And Cassac's case was, look, you acted with bias. You didn't bring an open mind to this process. You cannot be said to have acted impartially. And unfortunately, despite the warning of that litigation, I would argue that the exact same thing happened with this process. That, Mandisa Maya is an excellent candidate. She has done exceptional work as a Supreme Court of Appeal president. But her appointment by the president or the appointment of whoever potentially he decides on, because it is his constitutional prerogative to decide, it is not the JSC's, is going to be mired in the controversy that we see unfolding because the interview process appeared so manifestly biased against certain candidates and unfortunately favorably biased towards her. And that is not fair to her, and it's also profoundly misogynistic because what underpins that is the belief that a woman candidate could not get the job on her own, and that she needed to be helped in some way to get a position that she is manifestly and clearly qualified to get in the first place. So there is a profound problem here, and I think we need to reflect on it going forward, given that there are now going to be Constitutional Court justice interviews in April this year.
Karyn Maughan, quickly before I come back to Sbu, how do you see the process unfold from here on? Because there are clear indications from organizations such as the Helen Suzman Foundation that they are going to mount a legal challenge against this. Just earlier I had Freedom Under Law, who is an NGO that is being consulted by the Helen Suzman Foundation. How do you see things unfold given the successful challenge we saw, which then saw a rerun of interviews in October last year?
Look, I mean, there is a potential for legal challenge, and ultimately all that I would understand to be the result of that would potentially be a rerun of the interviews. Because the Constitution requires the President to consult with the JSE. But it certainly doesn't mean that he has to listen to them. I think what happened with these interviews is there was an attempt to use politics to obtain an outcome that couldn't be obtained through the law. So even this decision to recommend a single candidate, a number of legal experts saying that's simply not appropriate, that all the commission needed to do was interview the candidates and say whether or not there was a basis to say that any of them were unsuitable, to present a report to the president commenting on their strengths and weaknesses, and then ultimately to leave it in his hands. But what they've done through this process by coming forward with one candidate, and I understand within the deliberations there was a huge amount of debate from the many of the JSE commissioners about the appropriateness of this, is essentially to push him into a corner. But remember, of course, Goli, that he has to also consult with leaders in the National Assembly and seek their input. That the JSE is not the only body that he needs to consult with, and that he has an innate discretion under the Constitution to decide to, go along with what the JSE has recommended or to make his own decision. That is what he is constitutionally allowed to do. And we must remember that this process is, because it is so unique, because we have never in South African history, apart from in 1996 when there were two candidates under Nelson Mandela put forward and interviewed by the JSE, who then agreed by consensus that one would probably, that they felt they supported one over the other, though they said that both were suitable. That, we don't really have a playbook here. And ultimately, and this needs to be stressed, even, we've seen presidents in the past putting forward one candidate. The JSE is not the body that decides who the Chief Justice will be. It has to be the president. It is the president. And so, these legal challenges, which may well, show that the JSE process was fundamentally flawed in the way that it conducted itself, ultimately, has no bearing on the fact that it has to be Ramaphosa's call on who will lead the judiciary. That exists within his sole discretion, even though he has to consult these other bodies.
Sbu, an overt political agenda played out. Karyn Maughan, these are Karyn Maughan's observations. You and I have discussed the president, a man with the long game, sometimes overly consultative. How do you see him taking this forward? Does he ignore this? And my gut says he's not going to. He's going to go with Justice Mandisa Maya, but it doesn't take away what some people are seeing as a very flawed process through which she came through.
Well, I think, Claudia, perhaps let me start where Karyn left off, in that it is the president who chose this option. I mean, you'd recall when Justice Mogoeng, when he nominated Mogoeng, there was an uproar. And I think at that time there was even a judgment around rape that he had made, that was controversial, that he had made when he was the judge president of the Northwest, or whether he was a judge, when he was a judge in the Northwest, and that came under the spotlight. And if you are talking about this exchange between Lamula and Malema, well, there was an exchange even then between the then Deputy Chief Justice, Dikgang Moseneke and Mogoeng, who lost his patience when he was asked one of the questions. So that we are here is through a process that the president chose. And I think if it goes to court, the court will also be able to enlighten us as to whether that process was fair and just.
Yeah.
And going back to that question, is it okay to nominate one candidate as opposed to just checking if all of them qualify as per the requisite of the law? That is another open question, because I think the JSC itself is equally walking on, these are uncharted waters for everyone. You know, so I think perhaps then the court will be the arbiter in this particular case. But I do believe, though, that I do agree that Judge Maya qualifies. She is a competent judge. As she said in her opening statement, she's not there as a woman, but she's a judge with a proven track record with 23 years as a judge, and judgments and pieces in various journals, legal journals, that prove that she's worthy of it. It's just unfortunate that it happens under a cloud of controversy that we've seen.
Sbu, quickly before I move on from you, because these are probably going to be the final inputs from you, story that has caught your attention. I see you sitting with the City Press there. Yet another break-in at a key institution of state by a vagrant.
Well, I think this is the, I mean, I was having a chat with a colleague a while ago, that in the South African context, particularly post 1994 South Africa, issues of security and national security have never quite been on the top shelf. But currently, with all that has happened over just the past 2-3 months,
yeah,
it tells you that something is very wrong in our society. I think we may have recovered partially from what happened in July, yeah, but I think there's an unraveling of the security of the state, and I think that there is a realization, at least in some quarters, that the state is weak at all levels, because Musanda, or the farm as they call it, is supposed to be the most secure environment. But, well, we saw what happened in Parliament, and now suddenly there's another break-in. And then earlier this morning there was an attempt to burn the cathedral outside Cape Town. So something is happening in our society, and something very wrong, yeah, and I think right now something has to give.
Karyn Maughan, let's conclude with you. Justice will be served. This is the head of the NPA writing for the Sunday Times and talks about a crack team that is going to now take forward what is coming out of the Zondo process. Your thoughts? Should South Africans have regained confidence in the NPA?
I think what was so interesting was during the CJ interviews, DCJ Raymond Zondo speaking, or ACJ Raymond Zondo speaking about the potential use of private counsel to prosecute cases on behalf of the NPA, and actually telling the JSE that he had been engaging with Shamila Batoy, particularly about these state capture cases. I think that there are two obvious issues which are front of mind: the resignation of Hermione Cornier, and we now know from a story that was published, I think, in the Sunday Times, that it was out of a deep sense of frustration, yeah, and just sensing that there were a lack of resources and a lack of commitment to the prosecution of these cases. But also the death of Frank Dutton, who was the investigator at the heart of investigating alleged SSA abuses and actually investigating the insurrection. And so, there has been profound losses of personnel there. And if the NPA is to continue or to even take those cases on, it needs to have skilled people in its ranks. It needs to consider bringing in private counsel, and it needs to develop a clear and coherent policy about hybrid state-private prosecutions, and indeed private prosecutions if it wants to ensure accountability, because I know that parastatals like Eskom and Transnet are seriously considering litigation with regard to private prosecution, and given the billions that were looted from the state, one can understand why.
Karyn Maughan, thank you very much, senior legal journalist. Thank you very much for your contributions here. Sbu Ngalwa, Editor-in-Chief of Eyewitness News. That's almost difficult to roll out of my tongue because you and I have been here for such a long time being part of Newzroom Afrika. Thank you, colleagues, for your contributions. It has been a fruitful discussion.